The night was heavy with silence, and the old outpost stood on the edge of the valley like a forgotten guardian. Its stone walls carried scars of many battles, and the air smelled of ash and old blood. The torches on the walls flickered weakly against the cold wind. Few soldiers remained here. Most had been sent away after the last war. Those who stayed were tired men and women, holding on to duty more than hope. But deep inside, they all knew something was coming. The shadows in the mountains seemed to move on their own, and strange cries had been heard echoing from the cliffs. The quiet was not peace. It was warning. A lone rider approached the gates just before dawn. His horse was half dead from exhaustion, and his armor was cracked and dirty. When the guards helped him down, they saw his face pale with fear. He had come from the northern villages, and his words froze the air colder than the wind. He said, "The villages were gone, burned in one night, no survivors left." He spoke of creatures not seen before, tall, armored in bone, with eyes glowing like fire. They moved without sound, killed without mercy, and carried banners of black smoke. His last words before collapsing were clear. The war they thought had ended was only sleeping, and now it had awakened. Inside the outpost, the commander listened with a grim face. She had seen many battles, yet even her hands tightened on the table as the writer's story unfolded. Maps lay open before her, marked with fading ink of old victories. But new marks would need to be drawn now, and they would not be victories. She knew the outpost was not ready. Supplies were low, soldiers too few, walls weakened by time. Still, retreat was not an option. If they left, the enemy would pour straight into the heartlands. The outpost was the shield, and no matter how thin or broken, it had to hold. The soldiers gathered in the courtyard as the first rays of sunlight touched the stones. Faces young and old looked up at the commander as she spoke. Her voice carried strength, though inside she carried doubt. She told them the truth, that darkness was moving again, that their world was not safe, and that the outpost was the last line between survival and death. She asked them not for blind courage but for duty, for standing shoulder to shoulder when fear tried to break them apart. And as her words spread, something changed in the air. The soldiers, though weary, began to lift their heads higher. Fear was still in their hearts, but so was fire. At the edge of the valley, smoke was already rising. The enemy was near. Scouts reported strange movements along the ridges, as if shadows themselves were crawling closer. Birds had fled the skies, and even the river seemed quieter. The world held its breath. In the mess hall, the soldiers sharpened blades, checked armor, and whispered prayers. Some laughed loudly to cover their fear, others sat in silence, staring at the floor. Everyone waited for the first sound of war to break the stillness. That sound came at nightfall. A deep horn echoed through the valley, so low that the stones seemed to shake. The gates trembled, and the torches bent under the wind that followed. From the darkness beyond, shapes appeared, tall, armored creatures with burning eyes, moving in perfect lines. They carried weapons unlike any the soldiers had seen. Blades that shimmered like black glass, shields made from bone of beasts unknown. They did not shout or roar. They advanced in silence, as if the night itself had sent them. The commander stood on the wall, her sword raised high. She ordered the archers to fire, and arrows rained down. But many bounced off the strange bone armor, clattering uselessly to the ground. The creatures did not slow. They marched forward, their steps in rhythm, their eyes never blinking. When they reached the walls, they struck with a force that made the stones cry. The battle of the outpost had begun. Flames lit the night as catapults hurled fire. Swords clashed, men shouted, and the valley shook with the sound of war. The rider who had brought warning now fought with a borrowed blade, standing side by side with soldiers he had never met before. The enemy pressed hard, but the outpost did not fall in the first assault. For every soldier who fell, another rose to fill the gap. The walls burned, the gates cracked, but still they held. The commander fought like a storm, cutting through. The enemy with fury, her voice keeping the soldiers alive when strength alone could not. And above it all, the horn of the enemy blew again, deeper, darker, promising that this was only the beginning. The outpost was not yet lost, but the war had truly begun. Asterisk, the smoke hung thick over the battlefield, covering the sky and choking the air. The first assault had ended, but the enemy had not withdrawn far. Their strange shapes moved just beyond. The firelight, silent and watching. The soldiers on the wall could feel their eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness like burning coals. Every man and woman who held a weapon that night knew the silence was not safety. It was the pause before another strike. Inside the outpost, the wounded filled the courtyard. Healers ran from one soldier to another, binding wounds with torn cloth, and heating irons to seal cuts. The rider who had brought the warning lay on the ground, his arm broken, yet he refused to rest. He pulled himself up against the wall and sharpened his blade with his other hand. He said nothing but the set of. His jaw showed he would not leave the fight. Around him, others did the same. No one spoke of retreat. Even if their bodies shook, they stayed ready. The commander stood over the map again, her armor stained with ash and blood. Her lieutenants gathered around her, faces drawn and grim. The walls had held, but only barely. If the enemy returned in greater force, the outpost would fall. They argued about sending for reinforcements, though they knew help might never come in time. The heartlands were far away, and the roads filled with dangers. The commander listened, then gave her answer. Reinforcements or not, the outpost must stand. If it fell, every village and city behind it would be swallowed in fire. They had no choice but to fight. When the sun rose, the valley showed the scars of the night. Dead soldiers and shattered armor lay on the ground. The enemy corpses, however, were strange. Their bodies did not rot or bleed as men did. They crumbled into dust, leaving only shards of bone armor and black glass weapons behind. The soldiers looked at them with unease. What kind of creatures turn to dust when slain? No one had answers, and the question sat heavy in every heart. The next day passed in uneasy quiet. Scouts reported that the enemy had pulled back into the mountains, but the commander knew better than to trust silence. She ordered repairs on the gates, strengthened the walls with anything they could find, and had the soldiers dig traps and sharpen stakes around the valley's edge. The soldiers worked with tired hands, but the fear of another night gave them strength. The youngest among them whispered about the horn they had heard, that deep sound that shook the stones. Some said it was not a horn, but the voice of something greater, a master calling his army. The older soldiers silenced such talk, but in their eyes, the same fear lived. By evening, the air grew colder. The commander walked the walls, speaking to the soldiers one by one, reminding them of their duty, reminding them that the outpost was more than stone. It was the line between their people and the dark. Her words did not erase fear, but they gave it shape, turned it into something the soldiers could hold inside their chest like a shield. When she left them, the archers tightened their grips on bows, and the swordsmen checked their blades again. As night fell, the valley stirred once more. The scouts returned, breathless, with eyes wide. The enemy was not just regrouping, they were gathering. Hundreds of them moved down the cliffs in silence, their bone armor gleaming under the pale moon. Behind them marched larger figures, towering beasts with shields made of stone and eyes brighter than torches. And then came the sound again, the horn, deep and endless, rolling through the valley like thunder. The walls of the outpost shuddered as if they too feared the sound. This time, the attack came from all sides. The enemy swarmed up the cliffs, their claws digging into stone, while others charged the gates. Arrows rained down, but still, they came silent, unbroken. The traps caught some, spikes tearing through armor, but for every one that fell, 3 more pressed forward. The stone beasts smashed against the gates, each strike shaking the earth. The soldiers fought hard, their swords flashing in the firelight, but the pressure was relentless. On the northern wall, the rider with the broken arm fought with one hand, his blade cutting down enemies as they climbed. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but he stood like an iron post against the tide. Others fought beside him, screaming their defiance, holding the wall as long as their strength lasted. The commander herself led the defense at the gate, her sword a blur as she cut through the enemy. She shouted commands, her voice rising above the chaos, keeping order where fear might have broken them. But as the night dragged on, it became clear that the enemy did not tire. Their movements were as strong after hours of battle as they had been at the start. The soldiers, on the other hand, weakened with every strike, every breath. Blood stained the stones, fire ate at the gates, and the horns of the enemy sounded. Again and again. Still, the outpost did not fall. The walls shook, but they held. The gates cracked, but they did not break. The soldiers bled, but they did not flee. When dawn finally broke, the valley was littered with ash and dust. The enemy pulled back once more, retreating into the mountains like shadows vanishing with the sun. The soldiers leaned on their weapons, their bodies heavy, their eyes hollow. They had survived another night, but barely. The commander stood on the wall, looking at the horizon. She knew this was only the beginning. The enemy was testing them, learning their strength. The true storm had not yet arrived. The morning air carried no birdsong. The valley lay silent, covered with the remains of the battle. Dust and ash coated. The ground and the broken weapons of the enemy glimmered faintly in the sunlight. The soldiers walked slowly among the ruins, collecting their dead and carrying the wounded. Each face was marked with exhaustion, but none dared to speak of surrender. They had held the outpost again, though the cost was heavy. The fire of the enemy still seemed to cling to their skin, and the echo of the horn still rang in their ears. Commander stood on the tower, her eyes sweeping across the mountains. She searched for movement in the ridges, for signs of another wave waiting to fall upon them. Her lieutenants joined her, voices low as they discussed the battle. The truth was simple and heavy. The enemy was not trying to crush them outright. They were probing, testing, pressing at the walls to see how far the humans could bend before breaking. The real attack, the true storm, was still gathering somewhere beyond the peaks. And when it came, the outpost might not survive. By midday, a council was called. The remaining leaders gathered in the hall, their armor scraped, their hands shaking from lack of sleep. They spoke of options, though none were hopeful. Sending for reinforcements was again raised, but the roads were long and likely already cut off. The commander listened in silence, then gave her decision. A single scout would be sent through the secret pass in the west, carrying word of the enemy and the plea for aid. The rest would remain, to hold as long as the walls stood. It was a cruel choice, but she knew no other way. The scout chosen was young, barely more than a boy, but his eyes were sharp and his legs strong. He carried little more than a cloak, a dagger, and a scroll sealed with the commander's mark. That night, while the soldiers watched the walls, he slipped through the hidden gate and vanished into the mountains. No one knew if he would survive the journey, but they placed their hope upon his shoulders. The outpost returned to its silence, waiting for the next horn. Days passed without attack. The soldiers patched the walls, reforged weapons from the enemies, glass blades, and whispered in the dark about what lay beyond the ridges. Some said the enemy came from under the earth, others that they were born from fire itself. None had seen where they retreated to, only that when the sun rose, they were gone. This silence felt worse than battle. Every hour stretched like a rope, pulling tighter around their necks. On the fourth night, the silence broke. A scream rose from the eastern wall, sharp and short, cut off before it ended. The soldiers rushed to the battlements, torches raised high, and what they saw froze them. One of their own hung against the wall, his body pierced through with black glass, pinned like prey on a hunter's spear. His eyes were wide, his mouth open in terror, but no sound came. He was already dead. The enemy had not attacked in force, they had struck silently, leaving only fear behind. The commander ordered the body brought down, her jaw tight with anger. She knew the enemy was playing with them, striking in shadows to weaken their courage. She refused to let it work. She spoke to the soldiers that night, telling them not to bow to fear, not to give the enemy the victory of despair. Her words carried strength, but in the hearts of the soldiers, unease grew. If the enemy could reach them even without an army, what chance did they have when the full storm came? The next day, a strange discovery was made. In the dust where the enemy had fallen, hidden beneath shards of bone, one soldier found a piece of stone marked with symbols. The marks glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The commander had it brought to her, and even she felt the power in it. None could read the symbols, but all felt the weight of it. It was not just a weapon, it was a sign. The enemy carried more than swords and shields. They carried something older, something that tied their strength to forces the humans did not understand. That night, the horn sounded again. But this time, it was not one horn. It was many rising together, filling the valley with a roar like thunder rolling forever. The walls shook, and the soldiers gripped their weapons until their knuckles turned white. From the ridges, lights appeared, hundreds of burning eyes descending like rivers of fire. The enemy was no longer testing. They were coming in full. The outpost braced itself for the storm. Asterisk, the horn shook the stones until dust fell from the old walls. The soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, staring into the darkness where countless burning eyes glowed. The commander raised her sword, its edge catching the torchlight, and shouted for the gates to be barred and the archers to ready their bows. No one needed further orders. They all knew this night would be unlike the others. The storm had come. The first wave broke against the walls with a crash that seemed to split the night itself. The bone-armored warriors climbed like spiders, their claws digging into stone. Arrows rained down, cutting some from the walls, but more took their place. At the gate, the stone beasts advanced, their massive fists pounding the earth. With each strike, the old wood shivered, splinters flying, iron bolts bending under the force. The soldiers roared back, pouring boiling oil over the attackers, firing bolts from heavy crossbows, and meeting those who climbed with blades and axes. The air filled with sparks, screams, and the crack of stone under siege. On the western tower, the rider with the broken arm stood again, blade in hand. His face was pale with blood loss, but he fought like a man possessed. Every time an enemy claw reached the top of the wall, his sword cut it away. The soldiers around him took strength from his fury, shouting louder, striking harder, as though his spirit had spread into them. The commander, seeing him from across the courtyard, felt a flicker of pride. Even the broken could stand tall. The enemy pressed harder, their silence more terrifying than any battle cry. Not once did they scream in pain or rage. They moved like machines, each strike perfectly timed, each blow part of a rhythm that seemed older than the stones themselves. The commander fought at the gate, her sword flashing in the firelight. She cut through armor, through bone, through shadow, but for every one she struck down, another pressed forward. Her voice rose above the chaos, steady and fierce, commanding her soldiers not to falter. Her presence was the line they clung to, the anchor in the storm. The battle dragged on, and the walls bled fire. Oil turned stone black, torches fell, and flames rose into the night sky. The enemy did not break. They climbed higher, struck harder, pressed closer with each passing moment. The gate, though barred, shook with every strike of the stone beasts. Cracks spread across its surface, wide enough for firelight to spill through. The soldiers braced beams behind it, their backs against the wood, pushing with all their strength as the monsters pounded. Their bones rattled under the force, but still they pushed. Suddenly, a cry rose from the northern wall. A breach. The enemy had poured through a crack, climbing over collapsed stones, tearing into the defenders with black glass blades. The soldiers rushed to close the gap, but the enemy moved fast, slicing through armor, pushing toward the courtyard. The commander saw the danger and called for her lieutenants. She led half her force to the breach, her sword cutting a path through dust and flame. The clash in the courtyard was chaos, steel against glass, fire against shadow. Bodies fell, both human and enemy, the stones slick with blood. Amid the battle, the glowing stone found earlier was struck from a soldier's pouch. It rolled across the ground, its symbols burning brighter with each second. The enemy seemed to sense it. Their movements shifted, their focus turning toward the stone. They struck harder, faster, cutting down anyone who stood between them and the glowing shard. The commander noticed, her eyes narrowing. This stone was not just a relic, it was something the enemy wanted desperately. And if they wanted it, she would not let them have it. She ordered one of her lieutenants to seize the stone and guard it with his life. The man obeyed, clutching the shard to his chest as he fought his way back behind the line. But the enemy pressed after him, their burning eyes locked on the symbols. Wherever he ran, they followed, their silent march breaking the formation of the battle. The commander realized then that the stone was more than a weapon. It was a key to something hidden, something the enemy sought with a hunger beyond war. The gate finally gave way with a sound like thunder. The stone beasts crashed through, splinters flying, and the defenders at the gate were hurled back like leaves in a storm. The courtyard shook under their steps as they advanced, swinging their massive fists, crushing men where they stood. The commander, bloodied and tired, roared her orders once more. The soldiers regrouped, closing ranks around the courtyard, their blades flashing against the giants. Fire spread across the walls, shadows leapt higher, and the horns of the enemy echoed without pause. The outpost was no longer just a fortress, it was a furnace, burning alive with battle. The soldiers fought as though the world itself depended on them, for they knew it did. And still the enemy pressed, silent and endless, their burning eyes unblinking as they marched into the flames. The commander raised her sword high, blood and fire dripping from its edge, and shouted to her soldiers. They answered with a roar, and the battle raged on into the darkest night the outpost had ever known. The courtyard was drowned in fire and screams. The stone beasts crushed men beneath their fists, while the bone-armored soldiers moved in silent waves, cutting down defenders who stood in their path. The commander's sword never rested, her voice rising over the chaos to call her soldiers into formation again and again. Yet through all the madness, the enemy's eyes were fixed on one thing, the shard. The lieutenant who carried it stumbled through the smoke, clutching the glowing stone against his chest, his armor dented, his breath ragged. Wherever he ran, the enemy surged after him, as though the shard called to them. The commander saw it clearly now. The enemy did not seek blood alone, they sought the stone. Its glow pulsed brighter with every moment, and the air around it seemed to hum with a low, deep vibration. Soldiers near it felt their skin crawl, their hearts beating faster, as though some invisible force reached inside them. It was not just a relic of battle. It was alive with power. And if the enemy claimed it, the outpost would fall faster than any wall could break. The lieutenant tripped over a broken beam, nearly falling as a bone-armored warrior lunged at him. At the last moment, the rider with the broken arm cut the enemy down, his blade flashing despite his exhaustion. He grabbed the lieutenant's arm, dragging him back toward the inner tower. "Keep moving," he shouted, though his voice was hoarse. "Don't let it fall." Together, they pushed through the chaos, their swords slashing, their bodies straining against the tide pressing toward them. In the shadows of the wall, the commander fought her way toward the lieutenant. She cut down 3 enemies in a blur of steel, her armor blackened with ash. When she reached them, she ordered both men to take the shard into the tower's heart. "Protect it," she said sharply. "Even if the outpost burns, that shard must not leave these walls." Her eyes were fierce, her voice steady. They obeyed, retreating into the tower with the shard glowing like fire between them. The commander turned back to the fight, her blade raised once more. The battle raged until the night gave way to gray dawn. By then, the courtyard was a ruin of ash and broken stone. The gates were shattered, the walls cracked, and the soldiers cut to less than half their number. The stone beasts, though many had been slain, left trails of destruction wherever they had walked. The enemy finally pulled back, retreating into the ridges as they had before. But this time, their horn was not triumphant. It was hungry, a sound, promising they would return until the shard was theirs. The survivors leaned on their weapons, breathing hard, their faces hollow. They had lived through the night, but their strength was nearly gone. The commander gathered them, her voice heavy but unbroken. She told them what she had seen, that the shard was not just a stone but the heart of the enemy's purpose. "They will come again," she said. "Not for us, but for it. And as long as we hold it, they will not stop." Her words settled over the soldiers like cold rain, yet none spoke of giving it up. They had seen the enemy's hunger. Whatever the shard meant, it could not be allowed to fall into their hands. Inside the tower, the lieutenant and the rider placed the shard upon the old stone altar. Its glow spread across the walls, lighting the chamber with strange patterns. The symbols carved into it shifted, as though alive, pulsing with each breath. The rider reached toward it, his broken arm trembling. When his fingers brushed the surface, a sudden vision struck him. He staggered back, clutching his head, eyes wide with shock. In his mind, he had seen fire swallowing whole cities, shadows marching across endless fields, and the horn sounding until the sky itself split. He gasped, his voice shaking. "It is not just a weapon, it is a door." The lieutenant stared at him, confused. "A door? To what?" The rider shook his head, unable to answer. The shard pulsed again, brighter, and the chamber seemed to tremble. Outside, the soldiers felt it too, the walls vibrating softly, the air heavy with unseen weight. Some whispered prayers, others clenched their weapons tighter. Whatever the shard was, it was more than any of them had guessed. And the enemy would stop at nothing to open that door. That evening, scouts returned with news that turned blood cold. The enemy was no longer hiding in the mountains. They were gathering in the valley itself, their numbers greater than before. Hundreds of burning eyes glowed in the dusk, and behind them, the horn of the stone beasts bellowed like thunder. The commander stood on the wall, her face lit by the last light of the sun. She knew the truth then. The next battle would not be a test, it would be the end. The outpost would either hold against the storm or be swallowed by it. The valley burned with countless eyes. As darkness fell, the enemy advanced, not in small waves but in a sea without end. Their horns shook the earth, and the stone beasts marched in perfect rhythm, their massive bodies lit by fire. The outpost, broken and bleeding, stood alone against the storm. Every soldier knew this would be their last stand. The commander walked the walls, her voice steady, her eyes burning with the same fire as the shard inside the tower. She told her people that, if this was the end, they would meet it with swords in hand, not fear in their hearts. The enemy struck as the night deepened. The gates were already shattered, so they poured through the opening like a flood. The soldiers roared and met them head-on, blades flashing in the firelight. Steel clashed against glass, sparks filled the air, and the courtyard turned into a storm of blood and ash. The rider, his broken arm bound tight, fought with one hand, cutting down enemy after enemy, his face grim but unyielding. The lieutenant guarded the shard in the tower, his sword raised against any who came near, his body a shield between the enemy and the glowing stone dot. As the battle raged, the shard pulsed brighter. Its symbols shifted faster, glowing like firebrands, filling the chamber with light. The air vibrated, and a low hum rose, growing louder with every heartbeat. The rider felt it even in the courtyard. The shard was not waiting. It was awakening. He fought his way toward the tower, shouting for the commander. When she joined him inside, her eyes widened at the sight. The shard floated now, lifted above the altar, its glow flooding the room. The symbols twisted into a circle, a shape like a gate, and through it flickered glimpses of another world, burning skies, endless armies, shadows stretching beyond sight. The rider's voice shook. It is not just a door, it is a summons. They want it to open, to bring their full strength through. The commander's jaw tightened. The shard was the enemy's key, their path to unleash horrors greater than the outpost had faced. If it opened fully, no wall, no city, no kingdom could stand. The choice was clear, though it cut like a blade. The shard could not be protected. It had to be destroyed, but destroying it was no simple task. The lieutenant struck at it with his sword, but the blade shattered. Arrows bounced away. Fire licked its surface without mark. The shard pulsed brighter, reacting to their strikes, as though feeding on their efforts. The enemy outside pressed harder, their silent rage doubling, as though they knew what was happening inside. The commander, sweat on her brow, realized only one thing could end it: life. Blood had awakened the shard when it was touched, and only blood might silence it. She looked at the rider, his broken arm trembling, his body cut from the fight. He shook his head. "No," he said, voice hoarse. "You need me alive." But the commander's eyes held the truth. It was not a matter of need, it was a matter of sacrifice. She placed her hand upon the shard, and pain shot through her body as light poured into her veins. The symbols flared, the hum grew deafening, and her knees buckled. Yet she did not pull away. She pressed harder, her blood dripping onto the stone, her strength pouring into it. The shard screamed, the sound not of stone but of something alive. It cracked, glowing lines splitting across its surface. The enemy outside howled for the first time, their silent discipline broken. Their ranks faltered, their claws clutching at their heads as the shard's power unraveled. The stone beasts stumbled, their massive forms collapsing into dust. The commander's body shook, her breath shallow, her eyes burning with the shard's light. With a final cry, she drove her sword into it. The shard shattered in a burst of fire and ash, the light swallowing the tower, the courtyard, the valley. When the light faded, silence fell. The enemy was gone, their bodies turned to dust, their horns silent at last. The valley lay empty, the night still. The outpost stood broken, but unfallen, its walls scarred, its stones blackened, its soldiers few. The lieutenant staggered to his feet, his ears ringing, his eyes searching. In the ruins of the tower, the shard was gone, shattered into nothing. But the commander lay still beside it, her sword broken, her hand burned black by the light. She had given everything to stop the door from opening. Her soldiers gathered around her in silence, their faces heavy with grief and pride. The rider knelt beside her, his broken arm shaking as he bowed his head. "She saved us all," he whispered. The lieutenant placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not just us," he said quietly. "She saved everyone beyond these walls." The soldiers raised their swords in salute, the firelight reflecting in their tired eyes. The outpost had held, not by strength of stone, but by sacrifice. The war had ended here, not with victory, but with survival. The valley fell quiet once more, the silence no longer a warning but a rest. The outpost, though broken, remained a shield. And the story of the commander's stand, of the shard destroyed, would spread beyond the mountains, carried on the lips of those who had lived through the darkest night. They would tell of the outpost that stood when all hope seemed lost, and of the leader who gave her life to keep the world free from the door of shadows.